and welcome to Let's Talk About It with Taylor Nolan. I am your host, and I am joined today by Emma Gray. She is someone who is really talking the talk and walking the frickin' walk. She is a senior women's reporter at HuffPost and is host of the Here to Make Friends podcast, which recaps Bachelor. So hello, Emma. Welcome to the show.
Hi, I'm so excited to be on your pod.
I know, me too. I've been looking forward to this, so thank you so much for joining me.
Of course.
Yeah, so we are both in New York, and I came out specifically when I did to New York to make sure that I could make your event. And your event was to celebrate the launching of your book.
Yes. Oh, I was so excited that you flew in for it. I was so touched. We had a really good time. Yeah. And somehow I wrote a book.
You wrote a freaking book. An amazing book. It's called The Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance. And I love that on the book, it's on the cover, it's a girl's guide to being a lady, but then over being a lady is joining the resistance.
Yeah, we wanted to play off of those old etiquette guides. Maybe once you were taught how to be a lady, but we don't need that anymore. Now we just want to teach you how to be involved.
Yes, I love it. And in your opening, you had a statement that said that this book is to all the girls who have been, are, and will be brave enough to fight for other girls. And that was so touching. I just automatically already felt like I was starting off the book, just joining this group of women, just feeling so empowered already from opening the book. But there's a few different chapters I want to kind of go over with you. But, before kind of introducing this, how did the whole idea even come up for you to write a book?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist at HuffPost, and I do cover The Bachelor, but in most of my job, what I do is cover the intersection of gender, culture, and politics. I was covering the 2016 presidential election, and I was at the Javits Center where the Clinton campaign was on election night. And I thought, I was going to be with my colleagues writing a story about our nation electing its first woman president. And obviously we ended up writing a very different story. Mm-hmm. And I interviewed a lot of Clinton supporters streaming out of her public-facing block party who were just full of grief and anger and fear. And then a few months later, I got to cover the Women's March in D.C. and really see firsthand what it looked like when people channeled their grief and anger and fear into civic action. And I found that to be incredibly powerful. And I wanted to create something that could be practical for young women who might be awakened or energized in this moment, but not quite know how to channel that energy.
Yeah, and it's a lot of energy to channel and to figure out where you put this. I remember for me, election night, I was at this music venue and, again, I was like, oh my gosh, we're going to be celebrating, the first female president. And they had these lights above the screen that were had different sayings. And just throughout the night, it went from yay to shit. We were just oh, this is not going the way we all thought it would. And there were some riots even in Capitol Hill in Seattle. And it's very hopeful and optimistic to know that, especially after reading your book, that there are a lot of ways actually to channel all of this energy that comes up from, politics.
Yeah, it's difficult and it can be incredibly overwhelming. And I just want people to know that, also regardless of where you fall on the political spectrum, a healthy political system is one where everyone's voices are engaged and involved and where everyone is educated and feels like they are part of that system. Mm-hmm. So that's, I think, the most important part of this. Get involved, do what you can, and make sure you know what's going on around you because it affects you.
Yeah, absolutely. And are there specific things that you would say, if someone reads the title of your book and they're A Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance, what is the resistance? What do you view us to be resisting?
I see the resistance as something that is somewhat amorphous and kind of ever-changing. Mm-hmm. I don't think it has necessarily a clear definition. Obviously, the current, quote, resistance, I think, sprung up in reaction to the election largely.
Absolutely.
And it was a real awakening moment for a lot of people who saw, oh, we're still at a point where perhaps groups in this country, such as women, people of color, immigrants, Muslims, are still facing certain legislative and cultural threats.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, I think the most important thing is that everyone should be picking one or two issues that they feel really, really passionately about, regardless of what those issues are, and channeling, as we said before, that energy into, you know, supporting the people. Yeah, into some kind of action, into supporting the people who are already doing the work around these issues. Because although the current resistance is new, the work that is being done around it is not new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very good point. And in your book, you really emphasize that young women are incredibly important to this movement. How so? I mean, I'm on board with you. I agree.
I know you do. I know, yeah, I got an ally in you. But I think women as a whole, and especially young women, are often dismissed, belittled, told our voices don't really matter, or that, you know, you're too young, you don't have the experience, you don't know what you're talking about. And so I wanted this book to really be a call to arms to say, no, your voice matters, your story matters, and you should feel empowered to use the tools in front of you to make a difference in your own community. And that's why I think young women are so essential. And again, there is this long history of young people as a whole, and young women specifically, being a driving force behind social movements, you know, from the young women that I referenced at the beginning of the book who were integral in the labor movement of the early 1900s to, you know, Diane Nash and other women who were organizing around civil rights in the 60s. Like any social movement that you look at throughout our history, there are young people and there are young women who were some of the most important voices behind those movements.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I loved even reading the book in a way was also kind of a history lesson, but like a really empowering one.
Like a fun one.
Yes.
Not boring.
Yes. Like history was not one of my favorite subjects, but the stories and everything that are told was just very, very moving. So I appreciate that you included all of that. And especially, you know, talking about young people, like we're seeing that happen now with the students in Florida who are speaking up and, you know, even getting criticized in the media by other power figures and politicians for being too young and that they should be focusing on their studies and not doing the kind of work that they're doing, that to resist that and push through that. And I mean, to have a Bachelor reference here, Becca M., who is, you know, very young, like faced a lot of obstacles to even just be respected because of her age.
Absolutely. And I think, you know, of course, that's sort of like a lighthearted connection, but it's still there.
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
still that impulse to dismiss someone or to say, you don't have the authority, you don't have the lived experience to speak on this. And yet what we're seeing going on in Parkland in Florida is so inspiring. And I really commend these teenagers for using what they have, which is social media, their own voices. Half of these kids can't even vote yet, and yet they are still dominating the national conversation around gun control in a way, you know, we haven't seen that really be able to happen in years. So I think that's super cool.
Yeah. And I mean, I think even thinking about the episode that I recorded last week with Alex talking about gun violence and talking about these students, like, we do need to hear their voices. Like, young people are so important. And I love that you emphasized this. And it's something I can personally relate to. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners can as well. You know, a lot of the viewers of the show are 18 to 24. And I think that's a really specific transitional period in women's lives where you are fighting extra hard in your careers to get that respect. And, you know, especially in the mental health field, something I can relate to. And being a woman of color, like, being a young person, speaking your voice and trying to be heard can be really difficult, but the things that we have to say are important and they do matter, and we do need to keep talking.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so important that people like you are using the platforms they have to talk about things that really matter and to reach people that might not have access to these conversations otherwise.
Mm-hmm, exactly. So I'd like to take a quick break from the show to tell you guys that the FabFitFun Spring Box is finally here. It's amazing. Some of my favorite items in the box are this adorable little clutch. And there's also this amazing massage roller. I just roll it on my thighs and it feels amazing when they're sore. And there's also this Anderson Lily candle. It smells amazing. And the outside of it is actually super cute. And you guys, these boxes, they have a total retail value of over $350, and you're getting it for only $39.99. I've honestly loved getting these boxes. Each time it's like Christmas. You never know what's going to be inside, and they give you great details on how to use the products. And you guys get full-size products, so there's no sampling of anything. They're cutting-edge products in every category. It's not just beauty. They also don't ever send repeat products, so it's always new stuff. It's always fresh. FabFitFun delivers boxes 4 times a year for just $49.99 a box. You guys can sign up for FabFitFun today to get your spring box. The FabFitFun spring box is in limited supply, and these boxes always sell out. Use my code TALK10 to get $10 off your first box. Go to fabfitfun.com to sign up and start getting the box for a life well lived. Use promo code TALK10 to get $10 off your first box. That's over $350 for only $39.99. Go to fabfitfun.com and use my code TALK10 to get $10 off your first FabFitFun box. Now back to the show. One of the things that you did throughout your book was used interviews from young women, from older women, from women of all different backgrounds, march organizers, longtime activists, senators. Was there a particular interview that really stuck out to you, or that caused you to really reflect on maybe your personal life or just the system in general?
Oh gosh, there were so many brilliant women that I got to speak to for this book. It was incredible, and I just wanted to hang out with them all the time. Hey, Elizabeth Warren, just hit me up for some lunch. It's cool. But one woman that I adored speaking to, who I'd actually met before, was Lucy McBath, one of the, quote, mothers of the movement. Her son, Jordan Davis, was shot at a gas station. He was unarmed, young Black man, boy even. I'll call him a boy. He was a teenager. And she has channeled that grief in the most incredible and inspiring ways. She is one of the most giving and positive people I've ever met. And she spoke so movingly about the way that we need to lift each other up, the way that she sees gun violence, which is obviously the main issue that she speaks about, but intersecting with, anti-racism efforts, intersecting with feminist efforts, intersecting with all of these different political issues. And also, she spoke really beautifully about the need to step back and recharge sometimes. She said that in the years just following Jordan's death, she went through a real identity crisis. If I'm not Jordan's mother, who am I? She said. And so she pushed herself, and became this incredible activist, but never took the time to recharge her internal batteries. And she almost completely burnt out. So she decided to step back and take a couple months to herself to step back from the public eye, and ended up coming up with all of these ideas that she said she probably wouldn't have come up with if she hadn't allowed herself that space. And I thought that was a really good lesson.
Yeah. I mean, I honestly got goosebumps listening to you talk about that. And, essentially what she's speaking to is self-care. And you have a section on this as well. And I did a episode on it a while back. But that chapter actually, I had written down a quote from her. So it's really funny that you brought her up as the person in that interview. But this chapter on intersectionality, I think, is super important to discuss today. The quote that I had written down from her was, she said, "You cannot focus on one issue without the intersectionality of all the issues." So I'd like to kind of invite you to have this conversation with me now on intersectionality, because I don't think it's something that is so mainstream. I don't think it's something that everyone knows about. And I think some people may talk about it, but then kind of be like, wait, but what is that really?
Yeah, of course. And I think that, I find myself saying over and over again, I sort of wish there was a word that felt a little less clunky or a little less academic.
Yeah.
Because I think people hear that word and they're like, oh, that's not for me. I'm not a part of that. When in reality, intersectionality affects all of us, because all that it really means is that we each have different pieces of identities that make up our lived experiences.
Yeah, we're not just one simple thing. We're very complex.
Right. You know, I'm a woman, and there are a lot of things that you and I can connect with over that shared gender identity and the way we walk about the world. But I'm also, you know, I'm a white woman, and I'm Jewish, and I'm straight, and I'm cisgender. So all of those things intersect with each other to create my own story and my experiences. And it's important to keep in mind that, you know, for all of us, that your own experiences aren't generalizable necessarily to everyone.
Yeah.
And also that when we are, you know, trying to advocate for women, we can't separate that fight from advocating for, you know, people of color, because they're women of color.
Yep.
Or we can't separate that from advocating for queer people, because there's a lot of queer women.
Yep.
So all of these things interact with each other. And that's really what Lucy was speaking to. And I think the point she made so beautifully is that if we're looking for real lasting solutions to a lot of these big issues, rather than just Band-Aids, we're going to need to address the whole.
Yeah, it's super powerful. And I think you're right. It sounds like this really big thing, but when you really take a step back, that's just looking at problems as a whole. It's looking at people as a whole. And I think it's something that we kind of do naturally, but sometimes when it's uncomfortable, we have to like really intentionally do. Something I learned from your book, I didn't realize that this term had only came up in like the 1980s in order to like address how laws against discrimination were being passed in terms of women in the workforce, but then also incorporating that with women of color. Just very interesting for me to reflect on, like, oh, only since like the 1980s, this was like a thing. Okay.
Right. And language is so powerful. Once we have a word to name the thing, then we can point to it, and it makes it so much easier to talk about because we can identify that term.
Yeah. And you talk a lot about like pushing white feminists to consider ways that race and gender interact. And I think you did a beautiful job of that, even just writing the book as a, you know, white, cisgender, straight female, including lots of different voices from all kinds of different women with different backgrounds. And what would you say, I mean, when thinking about feminism and like white feminism, you know, we did an episode on white privilege. What does it mean for you to look at feminism as a whole and to, you know, step outside of white feminism?
Yeah, it's been, you know, that was so important to me in writing the book. I think it was the first thing I brought up to my editor, is that if I can't get a critical mass of women whose identities are different from mine to talk to me, then I don't even want to move forward with this. It was so important to me not to center my own story and my own experiences too much, although I did want to, you know, include pieces of myself in the book.
Yeah.
And I think in any person's activism, we need to be stepping outside of ourselves. And one of the most important lessons that I took away just from interviewing activists of color and also white woman activists was that as white women, we don't always need to lead the conversation. And Sarah Sophie Flicker, who is one of the national organizers of the Women's March, she's a white woman and obviously organizes alongside women of color every day. And she said to me, you know, as white women, we so often worry, and I think this goes for any kind of allyship, you worry, am I going to say the wrong thing? Am I going to kind of step in it? You know, I'm going to do this wrong. And she said, the beautiful thing is that you actually don't have to worry about that because you don't have to say the thing. You just have to show up and listen. And it takes the pressure off of you. Yeah. And I thought that was such a great way to put it. Like, we don't always need to be leading the charge because there are people who are already doing that. And you can just show up and be like, hey, I'm here for you. You tell me what you need and I'll do it. And then when I go out and speak to other white women, that's when I'm going to lead that conversation and use my story and use my access to amplify the needs of other people.
Yeah. And I think I would apply that as well to, talking to people with different sexualities and just any kind of different background from yourself. But I think...
Or men, talking to men.
Exactly. And that's something makes me reflect on the white privilege episode where it's like, yeah, you don't always have to say the right thing. You don't even have to lead the conversation, but showing up and asking questions and like trying to really hear someone else's story and accepting it for what it is. Like not trying to fight that, and try to fit it into your box of what you think it should be, but really actually just listening to what the person is saying and what their story is and learning how you can better help. Yeah. I'd like to take one more quick break from the show to talk to you guys about Flex. Fun fact, did you know that tampons were invented by a man in the 1930s? I learned this recently, and I think because we avoid talking about topics like this, nothing's really getting invented. So let's talk about it. My period is pretty light, which meant that I actually hate using tampons because they're just so uncomfortable. And I recently started looking into different kinds of menstrual cups, and I found Flex. I'm totally obsessed with it, and I just had to share it with you guys. Flex is a menstrual disc invented by women for women. It's totally body safe and is not linked to toxic shock syndrome. Plus, it's wearable for up to 12 hours, so you only have to change it twice per day, even if you have a heavy period. It's so comfortable, you can't feel it at all while you're wearing it, and it actually has helped relieve my cramps. I'm a huge advocate in finding a product that works for you, so I partnered with them to give you a 3-month trial for only $12 plus shipping. Just go to IHateTampons.com and use my code Taylor to try Flex for 3 months for only $12. Now back to the show. Speaking of stories, your chapter 5, you talk about how our stories matter. And even though that sounds a little trite, but it's very true. And you actually, this was a section where you were personal and opened up about your struggle or experiences with having generalized anxiety disorder. Do you want to share a little bit about kind of what that was like for you? I believe you said it was 2010 that you were diagnosed with that.
Yes. 2010 was when I got the diagnosis. It's when I really went into therapy in earnest. And I realized that I certainly struggled with my anxiety for my entire life. And it was only when I decided, I can ask for help with this thing that has always been present.
That you don't have to do it all on your own.
Exactly. And I think that a lot of women, there's such a stigma, especially in a specific way, I think, for women, because there is this history of, the trope of the hysterical woman, the crazy woman. There's a lot of fear and anxiety around even addressing having any sort of mental health issue. We don't want to be labeled as crazy. Yeah. And yet the thing that has made me the highest functioning and able to deal with my emotions and my life in the most productive way has been reaching out that hand and saying, I need help, and I'm going to write about my anxiety, and I'm going to sit in therapy, and I'm going to be really open with other people about that struggle. And it's been so liberating.
Yeah. You're speaking up, you're owning your story and sharing it. And I think that is the most powerful part of, helping to reduce the stigma around mental health. Because like you said, it's not just also that women are, scared to speak up because there's this history, but then it's also this, really crappy cycle where women are more often being diagnosed and women are more often speaking up than men, to where then, there's this whole other flip of the table where, I don't know if flip of the table is a saying, but I'm making it one, where, men don't speak up and come up with these issues, and where, speaking up and saying that you're a woman who's struggling with any kind of, emotion or mental illness, that you are very much labeled and pinned as this specific thing, as if it wasn't already hard enough as women to speak up and feel like our voices matter about something. This can sometimes feel like it's devaluing our stories.
Right. Absolutely. And I think that the most important thing about telling our stories is that when we do that, we give other people permission to tell their stories. And I saw that when I started writing about my struggle with anxiety. I got so many emails and messages from people who related and wanted to talk about therapy. I'm sure, I know that you get so many messages every time you do an episode from your listeners, and you are opening up that space as well. And then we also see this within activism. Look at the Me Too movement. It is literally a movement built around storytelling and someone saying Me Too, which gives space to other people, men, women, people of all gender identities, to step up and say Me Too as well.
Yeah. It's a beautiful thing that's happening. And you're right. I do get a lot of letters on, different kind of mental illnesses. And I have one here on anxiety that I would love to share with you.
Yeah.
So this listener says, I just want to let you know how much I appreciate you having a podcast that discusses mental health. I feel like it's still incredibly taboo and not taken seriously. My father tells me that my anxiety is all in my head when I just recently got diagnosed with generalized anxiety disorder. It made me feel ashamed that I need a medication in order to not be a complete mess. But my friends always say, you wouldn't feel bad for treating a physical illness, so don't feel bad for treating a mental illness. Your podcast is really helping me come to terms with my generalized anxiety disorder. I've been looking for a good therapist in my area and even asked my general practitioner for recommendations, but that didn't lead anywhere. Do you have any tips on how to find a good therapist?
Oh, I love this letter.
Yeah, me too. First, I think it's amazing that she's already pointing out, or that at least that she has a friend who can support her and remind her that if we're going to treat physical illnesses like it's no big deal, that it's totally acceptable and supported, then we should feel the same way about mental illness. Love that. Also for, finding a good therapist, a website that I've used frequently and that I've shared a few times is psychologytoday.com. I find that one to be super easy to use. Emma, how did you go about finding a therapist or even coming to terms with your anxiety and sharing that with people?
Yeah, the first time I saw a therapist, I was in university. So I just went to my campus clinic and was set up with someone. And then I moved to New York and sort of stopped treatment for a while and then realized, nope, still got a lot of work to do. Got to go back to this. And I was lucky enough, actually, my aunt is a therapist in Boston, and she asked a colleague of hers in New York to recommend a list of people. And so I went through that list, called the ones that were taking new patients, and just, sort of tried them out and found one that I really, really loved. And so I would say that is really helpful. Like, even if one therapist that you reach out to isn't taking new patients or their schedule doesn't work, it can be helpful to ask one mental health professional to refer you to other people in their network.
Yeah. And if you reach out to someone and they say that they're not accepting clients, usually they should be providing you with references to other clinicians that might be able to see you. But I'm curious if you'd be open to sharing kind of how you knew that you wanted to go to therapy or that you needed to, what kinds of things were coming up for you.
Sure. I think originally, so I was a camp counselor for many years, and I was in one of my last summers working, like towards the end of college, I was in a leadership position, and I just found myself getting extremely overwhelmed when people would be asking me a bunch of questions. I just wasn't quite able to process everything and organize those things. And I would get very overwhelmed to the point that I would feel my body start to kind of shut down. Yeah. And at the end of that summer, I sort of thought, I shouldn't have to live with this. I shouldn't be responding to stressors in this way. I need better coping mechanisms. And so that was the first impetus. And then when I moved to New York, it was actually dating that made me super anxious. And I sort of recognized a pattern in myself where I would have an intense amount of anxiety, if someone wouldn't text me back, if people were bad at communicating, and guess what? Dudes in New York, terrible at communication.
Yeah. Dudes everywhere, honestly, sometimes.
Everywhere.
I just had a conversation with my girlfriend in Germany about getting that anxiety because this is the first day that they haven't talked in since the weekend. And it was
so
that anxiety
common.
coming up. Mm-hmm.
So common. And I think, of course, a little bit of that anxiety is normal, but I recognized in myself that it was almost causing this instinct to push someone to reject me just so that I could relieve that physical anxiety. And I had a moment where I thought, I don't want my anxiety to be making decisions for me.
Yes.
I need to be in control.
Mm-hmm. You need to be in the driver's seat. We use that metaphor here a lot.
Yeah. So that's exactly it. And I knew that in therapy, I would probably be able to find the tools to allow me to take the driver's seat. And it's been, I've been in therapy pretty regularly for years now with the same therapist. She probably knows me, better than anyone besides maybe my own mother. And it's an incredibly productive relationship. And it's really helped me manage my own anxiety. So I always say that, I think everyone should be in therapy.
Yeah. And it's never means to an end, I guess. There isn't ever, I think, in my opinion, okay, you're cured. No need to come to therapy anymore. For me, I feel like there's always things that we're going to be experiencing and new things that are going to come up in our lives that are going to cause these different emotional disturbances, like an election, for example. Where it might cause you to, take a step back into the therapy room. But,
my roommate is a therapist. She's a licensed social worker. And she would tell me right after the election, just she got all of these new clients and they were just coming to cope with the feelings that those, national events caused.
Yeah.
So
it's a very real thing. Yeah. I believe the APA even put out something when that happened just about, brushing up on and even with travel bans and all that stuff coming up with, getting yourself culturally educated and politically educated in order to work with clients, because there has definitely been an increase in people seeking help because it's just hard to make sense of the world right now. But I want to get slightly clinical here for a second and differentiate between, like you mentioned earlier, you could tell that some of the anxiety was just normal anxiety, but then you reached a point where you're like, okay, wait, this is a problem. And there's a few different ways you can come to that realization. But specifically, do you know what the DSM is?
I do.
Okay, wonderful. So some people do not know what the DSM is. It's the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, which sounds scary, but it's essentially just how therapists guide to diagnose different disorders. So if you really want a clear-cut definition for what a diagnosis looks like clinically, that's a book you can check out. And so for generalized anxiety disorder, because anxiety is something, so prevalent, it's a normal feeling that we all get, but then sometimes it becomes a little excessive, and that's when it becomes a disorder. In the DSM, it's defined as just having excessive anxiety and worry that's difficult to control. It occurs more days than not for at least 6 months. So it sounded like for you, you realized this was kind of ongoing in your life. And that it's followed with at least 3 of these symptoms: restlessness, easily fatigued, difficulty concentrating, irritability, muscle tension, sleep disturbance. And honestly, I think to a certain extent, all of those things can be experienced in one day. But, if those are all happening, for more days than not for 6 months, then there definitely might be something going on. And, I think it's super empowering, and I very much appreciate you opening up about that, not only in the book, but also in the article you wrote and here with me, because it can be very uncomfortable and lead to a vulnerability hangover, sharing this kind of stuff.
Yes. And well, you know all about that from being on a show that literally forced you to be vulnerable on a very big platform.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There were a lot of things that came from that.
That's like a month-long vulnerability hangover.
Absolutely. Well, more than that, there's the filming and then the
years.
Yes, exactly. There's the watching it, and then there's the after watching it, and then there's the next season that just triggers all kinds of things. But, I think it's it's really interesting that you incorporated this anxiety piece in talking about joining the resistance, because I think, again, our mental health is something we can like push down and just say, you know, nope, we're fine. We're strong women. Like, we don't need that help. Like, we're good, you know, but it doesn't make you weak to say that you're struggling. And I think, just really empowering for us as women, and also for men to join the conversation on things that we are struggling with. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you also for opening up this conversation. I completely agree with everything you've said.
Yeah. And you also kind of dig into, you know, in your part 2 section, which is more of the how to resist like a girl, talk about lady clubs and covens, and that this is where the real magic and the real work happens. And that's kind of how I feel, even with just the sharing your story part, you know, that your story matters, that's a part of the lady clubs.
Yeah, I think women-only spaces can be incredibly, incredibly vital. Not to say, like, don't include men in any of this. You know, I love talking to men. They're great. but that being said, there is something really special about being surrounded by other women, having a certain level of common understanding of experience there. And often, you know, women are conditioned to sort of modulate their behavior around the comfort of other people, especially when those people are male. And we know from the research that so often women are less likely to speak up. Men often talk over women. Women's ideas are not received necessarily in the same way or given the same weight when there are men there. And so there is a real value in creating spaces where you sort of take that out of the equation.
Yeah, there have been many times where I can relate to that experience of being, you know, even one of them actually was with Colin, who was on the white privilege episode, and Derek, of the two of them talking. And I was trying to, you know, insert myself and be assertive and speak up. And eventually I had to say, hey, guys, I'm trying to also share here, you know, and be like, my opinion here matters too. And I know that for them, what I say is valued and it is important, but it definitely takes a different kind of place. And when you're surrounded with just males.
Exactly. And it's not even a conscious thing. It's not to say like these men, you know, don't care about the women around them and don't want to hear their stories. Obviously, Derek and Colin value you and value what you have to say, as you said. And yet we're sort of programmed and socialized in ways that are counter to that.
Absolutely. And I think you're right. There is this real power in being around other women. And while being on The Bachelor definitely has its own set of problems in relation to women friendships, but it also allows this weird bonding, like really strong bonding to happen between women. And I had never been in a sorority before or anything like that. So it was really interesting for me to see how, you know, the difference was in that setting to just have all that lady love.
I mean, that is my favorite part about watching The Bachelor, honestly. I'm always saying, like, the real love stories are between the women. Like, Kendall and Jacqueline's relationship is probably my favorite relationship of this season on The Bachelor.
They are wonderful, wonderful ladies. And how, I mean, are there like specific like lady clubs? Like how would you, I mean, not everyone's going to go on The Bachelor and develop this, you know, little friend group, but I mean, how would you suggest women go about like finding their lady coven?
Yeah. So it obviously depends what stage of life you're in. If you live in one of kind of a big major city, and you're in the workforce or you're some sort of independent contractor, there probably is a women's co-working space or a social club that exists. I'm a member of The Wing, which exists in New York right now, but is also expanding to DC and LA.
Awesome.
If you're in school, you probably can find some sort of feminist club or some sort of women-focused space that already exists that you can join. You also can just create your own.
Yeah.
You know, I have a really good friend who just sort of gathered a bunch of women into her living room right after the election. And it's turned into this monthly thing. And we just meet in her living room, and it's really awesome. So you can do this on your own without that existing structure. And you don't need like a whole lot of money or anything to do it. You just need a physical space and to put out the word to women.
I love that. And I think, again, that woman to woman support, women supporting other women can be so powerful, especially in feeling comfortable to share our stories, and plays such a huge role in our mental health. Social support is a huge part of treatment and just healthy self-care and mental health. But another kind of the last section of the book I want to touch on here, you wrote about self-care, and your subtitle for the chapter really cracked me up. Self-care, AKA how to avoid losing your mind while changing the world.
It can be really exhausting to be tuning in just to the news right now. There's so much going on. We're sort of being assaulted by a ton of information 24 hours a day. And while I do think that it's incredibly vital for us to be constantly educating ourselves and paying attention, we also have to give ourselves permission to step back sometimes and say, I'm going to log off Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, and I'm, going to turn my phone off and turn the TV off or turn the news off and do something that brings me genuine joy that kind of recharges that internal battery.
Absolutely.
And I know that that's something you talk about on the podcast.
Yeah.
a lot.
And even in our last episode, with gun violence and mental health, keeping up with these mass shootings when they happen, give yourself a break. You're not a terrible person for not following along, but sometimes it can bring on symptoms for you, and it can feel like you're experiencing other people's traumas. And it's very, very, very beneficial for us to take those breaks to unplug and focus on self-care. And in some ways, self-care can be related to being plugged in, to Netflix, but it depends on what works for you. What would you say are kind of your self-care go-tos? I know we've talked about therapy, and
therapy is definitely one of them. But I'd also say yoga. Yoga is a huge one for me because it just forces me to pay attention to my breath and my body and not get caught in a cycle of thoughts in my head, which is my normal state of the day. And also watching Netflix. I love watching a good TV show, just going down a rabbit hole, getting out of my own head and escaping into someone else's
exactly
story.
What I say. I'm taking in someone else's life, and I'm just really, I am in a different time period. I'm in a different life. I'm just being transported. It's a beautiful thing.
Exactly. There's a reason that I used to go to sleep to the Harry Potter books on tape. It's just nice to have a narrative that is not your own playing in your head.
And I love that you brought up yoga and this sort of meditating. Again, the girlfriend in Germany that I was just talking about earlier, our conversation is coming up for me here as well, where, she's having these just anxious thoughts about reaching out to this guy. And, did she text him? Did she not text him? Did she text him? Did she not text him? And I was like, well, this is a good opportunity for you to challenge yourself with this anxiety and to really sit with that. And she's like, why would I want to do that? She's like, that sounds terrible. And why would I want to do that? And I'm like, well, to move through it, sometimes that can be good for you to, think about why this is coming up and just breathing through it and being kind to yourself in that. We did an episode on self-compassion, and ever since then, I had always known what self-compassion was, but really digging deep into it, it's almost every day I'm battling these thoughts where it's be compassionate with yourself, talking about sharing your stories and, struggling with mental illness as a woman, be kind to yourself.
And it is a constant challenge. And it's certainly something that I've learned through yoga. Often the teacher will ask you, pick a word, set an intention at the beginning of class, and just sort of repeat that to yourself, even when you're, physically struggling. And often what I pick is self-love or kindness, just be kind to yourself, and repeating that while you're doing kind of these physically challenging poses. I don't know, for some reason it settles into your body more effectively.
Interesting. Yeah. My girlfriend was actually going to a yoga class as well. So I was like, yes, think on it in yoga. I have not gone to yoga, but I do occasionally do some in whatever space I'm in. Have you been able to identify any areas of self-care that perhaps were more unhealthy or that were actually like self-indulgence and not self-care?
I think it's a delicate balance. I think there's a tendency, because self-care has become this buzzword, we now are seeing sort of the consumerist end of it, where companies are kind of jumping on it and being like, just buy this thing. Yeah. It's self-care. Yeah. And I feel like that you kind of have to be aware of, because just sort of spending your money in various places, maybe buying a specific thing will be helpful to you. But there's a lot that, we're sort of told, like, if you'll just get this one product, then it will solve your problem with X. And that's usually false.
Couldn't agree with you more. And in that chapter, you also had a bunch of interviews from, different activists and whatnot sharing their self-care. And that I found was really moving and really nice to read. Was there a specific one that stuck out to you, or that was your favorite, or just like caused you to like reflect on your self-care?
Well, I did love Lucy McBath, who I mentioned earlier, but Janae Ingram, who's another one of the national organizers for the Women's March, mentioned travel as self-care. And I loved that, because I had never really thought of travel as a form of self-care, but there is something really sort of magical about stepping out of the setting that you're used to and just physically removing yourself from a lot of those everyday stressors, expanding your mind of what else exists in the world, seeing a new place. So I love that.
I like that. And it's, often when I think of travel, I think like stress, because I do a lot of it sometimes and it feels very stressful. But at the same time, there is this different energy that comes to you when you are traveling, and it's opening your mind in a different way that I think is self-care and self-exploratory. And that's actually like a really beautiful thing. Well, I just want to point out something in the book that I really, really loved, and like, thank you so much for including. There was the feminist mixtape. That was amazing. You had Fighter by Christina Aguilera in there, and I was like, yes.
Everyone needs a little pick-me-up. You need to like dance it out.
Absolutely.
Sometimes.
One of my biggest forms of self-care is just singing as loudly as I can in my car and just jamming out so hard. Like just
it feels so good. Like, why is it so satisfying? I don't even know.
It's like, I feel like it's such a pure form of expression, like you just don't care. You're like, I don't care if I'm off key. Like, I'm just going to sing this note.
Just go for it.
Yes, exactly. And then you also had a list of like empowering movies to watch, and that I felt was super helpful. Like it helps make it a book that you can like go back to and like refer to, like not just one that you read once and then put down, but that you can like go back to, and that the book is like kind of a type of self-care in a way.
Well, I appreciate that, because that is exactly how I was intending it. So it's a real relief to me to hear that is how you saw it.
Absolutely. And I also really loved, you had this whole section about these different organizations, like you talked about earlier, that there are already people doing all this work in fighting, for all of us as a whole. And is there any resources specifically that you want to make people aware of? Maybe it's just a quick tip of someplace they can go to get more involved in their communities, or...
Yeah, I mean, I organized the list of organizations at the end, sort of by topic area, so that people can really go with the thing or start with the thing that they feel most passionate about. I mean, for me, it's all of stuff around reproductive rights or sexual violence. And so, a few organizations that I love, like End Rape on Campus, I think is amazing. The National Sexual Violence Resource Center, obviously, I think Planned Parenthood is a really great organization. And the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health does really important work. So those are four that I'd start with. But, it's hard to even pick, because there are so many people who have been doing such incredible work for just decades. And that's why I needed a whole book for it.
Yes. Well, and that's why I think it's so important to, like, the way you had it organized out in the book was just like very clear to go through and didn't feel very overwhelming. Like, I know if I go and try to look at resources online, it feels like a lot sometimes. But you had like little prompts in there for, like, you know, reaching out to senators, like through email, through phone, and that I just was like, that's amazing. Amazing, Emma.
I'm so glad. I think, yeah. Oh, I love that. I love that.
I'm just like so proud of you. Like, I remember calling in to the Here to Make Friends podcast for the first time. It was like, I think it was the week of when my 2-on-1 aired, and I was in like such a deep, dark place. And I remember just laying in bed and talking to you guys, and I bawled my eyes out immediately after I got off the phone with you guys. But during our conversation, it was the first time, you know, I had been sucked into like the internet trolls on Instagram and Twitter and everywhere else. They were finding ways to contact me, and hearing you guys, you know, recap that and talk about it on the podcast made me just feel so relieved and like validated and just like connected and just so understood. And then I was just like, you guys are amazing, and I love you as a human, and just feel so proud to like know you as a person. And this is where I'm really thankful that Bachelor has introduced me to like wonderful people like you. So I'm honestly just so proud of you, like as a friend and as a guest on the pod. You know, it's been really, really great.
The feeling is so mutual. I mean, I always joke about it. Like, Claire and I started this podcast, Here to Make Friends, and then suddenly we realized a couple years in, we've gained these really beautiful, genuine friendships from something that I think a lot of people would look at and be like, oh, how silly and frivolous is that thing? You talk about that silly reality TV show that a bunch of ladies watch. And yet, you know, you can build connections anywhere. And I think that's such a good lesson for anyone to take away. Like, you will find allies and friends in the most unexpected of places.
Absolutely. And no joke, I have a picture framed. I've had this since I was in middle school, of a cat in a brown paper bag on the street, and he's like peeking out, and there's a cat in front, like looking in at him, and it says, "Friends can be found in the most unexpected places." So
amazing.
Yeah. On board there. But no, really, thank you so much for writing this book, and thank you so much for coming on the pod. It has been so amazing to know you and to talk about your amazing book here.
Thank you so much for having me. I can't wait to continue listening to your podcast. It's very good.
You. Well, you guys can get Emma's book, A Girl's Guide to Joining the Resistance, on Amazon. I will have links for ordering in the episode descriptions that you guys can check out. You guys can find Emma Gray on Instagram at Emma Lady Rose. You guys can also find Emma and the Here to Make Friends podcast on Instagram at Here to Make Friends Pod.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you guys so much for tuning in to another episode of Let's Talk About It. You guys can send us emails at ask.letstalkaboutit@gmail.com. You can also find the pod on Instagram at Let's Talk About It _podcast. Thanks so much. Talk to you next time.
This podcast is brought to you by Wave Podcast Network. Check out all of our shows, including the Brain Candy Podcast, I Don't Get It, Babes and Babies, Coffee Convos, and Let's Talk About It.